Oh, hello, and welcome to part two of exploring Geneva's core values. Today, we're going to talk about engaging culture faithfully. To start, I would like to tell a story from a famous stand-up comedian who tells a pretty good story of a guy who gets on an airplane, and when they're about to take off, they announce on the plane that, hey, this is going to be one of the first times that there's going to be Wi-Fi on this plane. So they start flying through the air, and about halfway through the flight, the Wi-Fi cuts off, and so all the YouTube videos and Twitter feeds that he was looking at are no longer available. And the guy beside him is like, "This is bull crap, right?" And he's astonished. He's like, "How can this be bull crap? Like, this is something you didn't even know existed until like 10 minutes ago." And this is an introduction to the first way I think people engage culture, which is complaining. A funny picture that you'll find on the internet shows a woman standing in line, and the caption above the picture says, "I would bet my entire paycheck that this lady's waiting to talk to a manager." And what that picture kind of signifies is that we have a culture where people complain more than they enjoy or show or reflect on the gifts that they have abundantly in their laps. And whether that be on our college campuses or while we're home or any of these places, we choose to complain about the gifts that are before us rather than making the best of it. And sometimes these complaints rack up so big that they turn into protest, or as Andy Crouch defines, as boycotting. A movie that came out a few years ago called Noah was protested by many different groups, especially evangelical Christians. And what they were complaining about was that the movie itself was extra biblical. So instead of just telling the more down-to-earth biblical tale that you'd find in any Bible in any store, it told more stories that you'd find in Dead Sea Scrolls, etc. And people were upset about this because it was using things that were extra biblical rather than just the Bible. And what they chose to do was they made posters and banners and videos online saying not to see this movie. And this is what Andy Crouch calls boycotting. It's you choose to just avoid it altogether rather than participating in a healthy conversation around the subject. The last and most destructive form of unhealthy cultural engagement is an amped up version of boycott. And I would define it as rejection. So in 1987, a photographer became famous because he took a picture of an image of a crucifix and submerged in some form of liquid. And when asked what the liquid was, because this artist was known for submerging images in liquids, he said that it was his own urine. And there was an outrage in multiple different communities about this image that was termed Piss Christ. And this image itself is very controversial, but adds a lot of cultural critique. The image has been destroyed several times and had to be reprinted by the artist. And in several cases, people have broken into museums just to vandalize it. The artist himself, when asked about it, said, "This image is not anti-Christian. A lot of people wear the crucifix as an accessory rather than realizing the grotesque nature of the cross and how those images apply to life." So those are just three ways that I commonly see people engage culture negatively. And I think to engage culture faithfully, we have to kind of give a definition to what culture is. So when I was in India, I met a man on a train, and we were talking, and I told him that I was studying religions in India, and we kind of just started getting into a discussion about the difference between US and Indian culture. And I was talking about, well, first, the US isn't a pluralistic, things like that. And he said, well, here's the thing. Typically when people think about culture, we think about culture in these big terms. So we think of the religious differences, the food, the art, the architecture, all of these things, which is a part of culture and does shape a culture. But he defined culture as the small choices people make in their daily lives and how they choose to go about their lives. So in India, it was typical that shops wouldn't open up until 10 a.m. so that people can spend time with their kids, and their kids didn't go to school till 10 a.m. either. And then shops would close at 4, and there'd be like a 2-hour lunch break in between. So really people only worked like 6 hours a day rather than the typical American 9 to 5. And he said it's like little things like that is what it means to be culture. So culture is, on one hand, this big picture, and on the other hand, it's these small choices. So I would like to present the opposite of the 3 negative ways that we engage culture with this in mind. So I'm going to present the opposite of rejection, which is listening. When I was in India, I learned about one of the most successful missionaries in India. His name was E. Stanley Jones. And E. Stanley Jones wrote a book, and this book was basically his story of him learning about and transitioning to India. And so he tells the story of how India at the start of the colonial period, but also missionaries coming to India, oftentimes people would try to reject common Indian customs and culture and try to instill Western ideas. And the people in Southeast Asian countries typically did not like that. They were open and willing to the idea of Christianity, but not to all of the practices that were common in Western culture. And so what he started to do, and what made him so successful in his ministry, is that he started to imagine what Christ would look like in Indian garbs. And so he would say, if Christ was to walk the Indian road, how would he approach people? And what this really became is this definition of listening. So instead of outright rejecting the culture, he more or less blended the two while keeping the core of Christianity so that people in India could participate in the wonders of Christianity. And it was wildly successful, and it helped a lot of people to grow in their faiths and to engage culture. And one of the ways to think about this in a more American context is that Martin Luther King Jr. says that it is riots that is the language of the unheard. And so instead of looking at people who are participating or acting in a certain way and just saying, look at them and look how they're acting, it's rather that you say, well, what are they really saying? And so it really takes this act of listening to engage culture faithfully. So if rejection is the opposite of listening, or rather I should say listening is the opposite of rejection, then let's talk about the opposite of boycotting or protesting. In his book Culture Making, Andy Crouch discusses a term called othercotting. And what othercotting is that instead of choosing to create different groups or people rejecting certain films, or mostly in pop culture, where they will choose to leave comments or create Facebook groups, or other people that are like choosing to derail some artist or film, then he says to othercot. And what othercotting is that you just choose to participate in something else. So instead of complaining about the R-rated movie, you just go to see a more family-friendly film. Instead of choosing to leave comments on some artist who has a music video you don't agree with, you just watch a different video. So what othercotting really is you're changing the market by influencing what products are more valuable. So you're choosing to have products that are more family friendly or more redemptive as what you're purchasing, because that's what's going to influence and change things, not by protesting online about certain images. So instead of rejecting, we're going to listen. Instead of boycotting, we're going to othercot. And the last way that I would like to propose that we can engage culture faithfully is that instead of complaining, let's rather create. So the way I like to think about this is, let's make the best of it, right? G.K. Chesterton says that the only way that you'll ever truly change something is if you truly love it first. One way to think about this is to think of Louis Armstrong. The backdrop of the time period that he was living in was the midst of the Cold War. There was plenty of racial segregation, and for Louis Armstrong to be a Black American who is trying to engage culture through music, it's a difficult time. But irregardless of all of this, he still writes a song called "What a Wonderful World," and the lyrics of this song are inspirational and beautiful. And then this is what I would say, is that he's not ignoring what's happening around him, but instead he's trying to create something that's more beautiful than what is surrounding in that time period. And so this is what I mean when I say creating something that redirects what could be happening around you. So going back to the story from the beginning, from the comedian, he kind of walks us through what I've been talking about this whole time. And he talks about the wonder of human flight. And he's like, it's amazing that we're sitting in a seat in the sky and we're not even realizing that all the stories that we tell each other, that one of the stories we tell each other is that I had to wait on the runway for 40 minutes, and that's a story in this country. But the problem is that if the Wright brothers were to hear about that, they wouldn't give up on the project. They would just keep trying to create flight.
So I'll leave you on this final note. It's not a matter of whether or not you have community. Just by having people in a similar space, you already have a community. What is up to you is to decide what adjective you want to have in front of community. Doug Bradbury.
And now to Becca to talk to us about inspiring, vibrant hospitality.
Hi, you're here. Welcome to my home. Come in, come in. It's so good to see you. Come on in, take a seat. I made you your favorite cup of tea. That's for you. And have a freshly baked muffin for you as well. There you go. I'm so glad that you're here this morning to talk with me about inspiring, vibrant hospitality, one of Geneva's core values. So here's the deal. I love talking about hospitality. I love talking about hospitality, experiencing hospitality, reading about hospitality, being hospitable. But I think that sometimes the church misses out on the radical countercultural lifestyle that is Christian hospitality. I believe that hospitality is at the core of the gospel, and that we know and believe that Christ welcomes us, strangers, messy, ugly people, into his family, and that we as Christians get to help live that out by being hospitable to one another. Like I said, I think the church misses out on this example of hospitality that Christ offers. So this morning we're going to explore a little bit together about two different types of hospitality: castle hospitality and kingdom hospitality, and see what Christ has to say about the ways that we welcome others into our lives. All right, so first we're going to talk about castle hospitality. Picture a castle in your mind. Maybe you've been to a castle, maybe you've seen a castle in a movie or have been to Disney World before, but picture a castle. I also have a picture to help us out. So look at this picture of a castle with me. It's pretty impressive. It's beautiful. And here's the deal, in castle hospitality, we're often trying to impress other people. We often think in our culture today that our homes have to look a certain way, or our lives have to be put together a certain way in order to welcome others in order to be hospitable. We think that we have to have something to offer others before we can welcome them into our spaces. And we often use hospitality as an excuse just to impress others or to show off. We don't use it as a way to be loving and gracious and kind, but we also use it as a way to just be impressive, to show off a little bit. All right, another thing I notice about castles is often they're located at the top of a hill. When I lived in Germany, there were two castles that we could hike to from my house, and to get to both of them, you had to walk up very, very steep, very long hills. Even this one is situated in the mountains on top of a big hill, and it has a pretty heavy door in front of it. Because often in kingdom hospitality, we need people to meet a certain standard or to rise to a certain type of living, certain standard, look a certain way in order to get into our castles. Because castles were made to keep certain people in and to keep certain people out. In our churches today, we do a really good job of welcoming other people who look like us, or think like us, or act like us, but we don't have a lot of space for the people that don't fit into those categories. It's easier for us to create dungeons in our head where we can kind of just push aside those people who don't fit into our mold, or who are messy, who have broken the rules, or just don't fit in with the culture that we've created in our churches or even in our homes. And so often we keep the doors to our castles locked instead of being wide open for people who need a place to go or need a place to stay, or people who aren't welcomed anywhere else. And castle hospitality isn't always bad. I think it's a good thing to be welcomed into my parents' home or my grandparents' home and to feel safe and to feel sound. Even to welcome you in today into my home, I hope when people come into my space that they feel cared for and feel loved. But castle hospitality is safe. It's easy for us to stay in our towers and only to welcome people who it is easy to love. But the deal is, if we only stay high up in our towers, in our castles that we build, then we're not able to really see people the way that Jesus does, and we're not able to really love people the way that God does. Because we'll only be surrounded with the people we choose to enter into our lives. And often that means that we'll choose people who are easy to get along with, easy to love, and then we won't actually be experiencing radical hospitality like Jesus demonstrates for us in the Gospels. All right, so if castle hospitality is one example, then our other example is kingdom hospitality. When Christ came to do his earthly ministry, he was constantly preaching a gospel of the kingdom and telling us that he wanted us to build his kingdom. And he talks over and over again about building the kingdom and not about building castles. In kingdom hospitality, there is room for everybody at the table. In kingdom hospitality, we have to be willing to give up our privacy and security and be willing to exchange them for welcoming vulnerability. Because in kingdom hospitality, people are seen and people are known. They don't have to clean up their mess before they come into our homes. They don't have to look a certain way or dress a certain way in order to come into our churches or come into our parties. No one is trying to impress one another, and grace abounds. Kingdom hospitality is messy. When we welcome other people into our lives, into our own brokenness, and when we welcome them in the midst of their brokenness, when we interact with people who don't look like us or act like us, it's gonna get messy. But we have to acknowledge that all people are valuable and made in the image of God, and that we're called to live life together and learn from one another. This means that we have to learn from other people who grew up in different cultures than us, learn from other people who haven't experienced the same things we are. And sometimes that might feel unsafe, but that's because we're opening ourselves up to different people in order to learn something else about God through them and from them, because everybody is valuable. The Gospels are filled with parables and with lessons that Jesus was teaching about his kingdom, and in these stories, the people that we often think don't deserve a place in our castles are the people that Jesus is welcoming into the kingdom. People like the prodigal son, people like all of the guests who are welcomed into the wedding feast when all of the high nobles and officials said no, that they didn't want to be there. It's these people and it's in these experiences when we get to live life with others that we truly are experiencing kingdom hospitality, a place where all people are welcomed, a place where we're not judging based on what people have done or not done, but where we believe that God's love abounds and that his grace is big enough for any of our biggest and messiest mistakes. I have this picture that I think represents kingdom hospitality well. This is a verse from Isaiah 2, and it says, "In the last days, the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains, and it will be raised above the hills, and all the nations will stream to it." We as Christians have the hope of a future in which believers from every tribe and every nation will be together, living in harmony for eternity. And if we have this hope of a kingdom that is just, of a kingdom that is loving, of a kingdom that is filled with hope for all of eternity, then we get to start living that out here and now in our everyday lives as we practice hospitality and as we seek to inspire vibrant hospitality. So now we're going to move on to another core value, which is honor one another, with Sam.
That nobody can deny. Oh, hey guys. Don't mind me all dressed up. I just thought that talking or being in the midst of a celebration would be a great way to begin talking about honor one another. Why? Well, what does honor mean? And how do we honor one another in our daily lives? So a synonym for honor is fête, which, if we don't know what that word means, fête is actually the French word for party. So honoring someone is very similar to celebrating them. We recognize people for what they've done and for who they are. So I'm going to save this cupcake for later, but let's talk a little bit about what honoring one another means. So now that we kind of get the premise of honoring is a little bit about celebrating and recognizing people, we have to ask the question, who are we supposed to honor? Who are we supposed to celebrate, have parties with, to recognize? What makes someone worth being honored? So let's take a look at a couple definitions that we find, and then maybe understand a little bit more about the word honor and who is worth being honored. So, a title of respect given to or used in addressing a judge or a mayor, a person that brings credit or to be valued, respect that people have for a person or an organization, adherence to what is right or to a conventional standard of conduct, a special distinction for a proficiency in an examination, a thing conferred as a distinction, especially an official award for bravery or achievement. There's a lot there. Still, what does someone have to have or be or do to be honored? I think a word that we saw come up a lot in those definitions is the word respect. Someone that we honor is someone who is worth being respected. And what are other qualities or traits that someone that is respectable has? So someone who is respectable is probably also virtuous, they're righteous, and they are just. It's good to celebrate people who are those things, who show that they are of high character, who has done something that is worth celebrating. So I want to talk about two different types of honor. And so there's the classical understanding of honor and then a biblical understanding of honor. The classic understanding of honor says that someone is honorable because of their works or because of their performance. Some examples that we can think practically, if you've seen the movie Mulan, then you know the song Honor to Us All. And so Mulan is supposed to go and do a certain thing, to be presentable, to marry, to look a certain way, and then she will bring honor to herself and her family. The Iliad and the Odyssey and the characters in those books that are continually striving towards finding honor and worth based on how well they perform in battle, who they are married to, all those kinds of things. The classical understanding of honor tells us that certain people are worth honoring and certain people are not worth honoring, and honor is based on what you do. You can lose it or you can gain it, but you have to do a certain thing in order to achieve it. Does this mean that it's wrong to give honor and respect to someone who has worked really hard at a task, performed well on a team, or maybe graduated, gotten a certain degree, any type of accomplishment? No, of course not. I think it's perfectly fine to throw on a party hat and celebrate people in our lives who have done certain things and achieved great and amazing ones. But I think that honoring doesn't stop there. We don't only honor people because of what they've done, or take honor away because of their failures or different things that they may have made mistakes in. I think that people are worth honoring not just because of what they do, but because of who they are. And biblically, everyone is worth honor and love and respect because they are children of God and created in his image. 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 21 to 25 says, "The eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you, nor again the head to the feet, I have no need of you. On the contrary, the parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable, and on those parts of the body that we think less honorable, we bestow the greater honor, and our unpresentable parts are treated with greater modesty, which our more presentable parts do not require. But God so has composed the body, giving greater honor to the part that lacked it, that there may be no division in the body, but that the members may have the same care for one another." This scripture is reminding us that whether we think that we are the most important part of the body and someone else is the least important part of the body, that is our perspective, which is absolutely false. God says that every single part of the body is valuable and important and needs to be there for the body to work, and that we must strive to give even more honor to those parts that we think need to be covered and not shown, because every part is worth honoring just because they are there and not because of how well they're performing or what they're doing. Romans chapter 5 verses 6 to 8 says, "For while we were still weak, at the right time Christ died for the ungodly. For one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person one would dare even to die. But God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Since therefore we have now been justified by his blood, much more shall we be saved by him from the wrath of God." Without Christ dying on the cross for us, we are all sinners who have fallen short and act in ways that are not worthy of honor. But because of Christ dying for us, we are automatically considered worthy, and therefore every single person is deserving of honor. And even for people who may not realize yet or have that personal relationship with Christ, he still died for them. And so it is our job to remind them of the honor that they are deserving of and give them that love and respect. I think that honoring someone is actually a lot simpler than we think it is, and really it's showing someone love and care and using our words and our actions to encourage them and uplift them. And so I think there are 3 main times in which we can take advantage of and show someone honor. So in the highs, in the lows, and in the even zones. So kind of a funny rhyme, but I think it's helpful. We can encourage someone in the highs, so when they've accomplished something. Like I said, it's not bad to honor someone when they have done something well, but we don't only honor them in the highs. We also honor them in the lows. So when they're discouraged, when something is going on that they're not happy with, or maybe they've made a mistake, and especially they need to be reminded that they are worth love and care and honor. And in the even zones is just every day. We can remind people that they are loved and they are worth honor because of who they are solely. Now, I'm gonna honor myself by eating this cupcake. So, I'll talk to you guys later. Yeah.
Thanks again for engaging with us as we learned about the core values of Geneva College. We're excited to continue to learn about these things and begin to apply them to all the work that we're doing here in this place. We truly believe in these values because they are at the core of Geneva College, but they're also applicable and representative of the work that God has called us to beyond this place as well. Thanks again for watching. I look forward to seeing you around campus.